So this is the third video for week 8, and in this video, I'm just going to talk about Augustine's notions, mention Augustine's ideas in book 8 of the Confessions that I think are a really helpful articulation of this idea of incontinence that we've been talking about. Now, Augustine, essentially at this point, he recognizes that the Catholic Church is true. He thinks that its sense of God is correct, its understanding of the world is correct, the way of life it proposes is correct. So he has an intellectual assent to Christianity, in other words. And he's a bright guy, so he's thought about this a lot. He's reflected on it. He's understood how all this fits together. And he says, no, it works. Christianity is the way to go. To put it in kind of bodily terms, he's got it in his head. His heart, though, is not committed to it. He doesn't have heartfelt, full on, deep commitment to being Christian. He hasn't made that from his heart the choice that he's going to live out. So what happens? Well, what happens is that he's torn. He's miserable. He's saying stuff like, give me chastity and constancy, but do not give them to me yet. He describes himself as almost being caught up in this situation where he's chained to sin. He calls sin like a bond or a sense of bondage. And he talks about iron fetters, that he has these shackles on him almost, and he can't get away from it. Now, in Augustine's case, I think there's two things that are mainly these chains or iron shackles or whatever that are keeping him in bondage to his own way of life, that are keeping him kind of enchained to this way of life. First, and I think most importantly, is his pride. Augustine loves his position as a teacher of rhetoric. He loves the status that comes with that. He loves this sense of kind of being superior and being well revered and having students and being able to be eloquent and speak well, and the honor and glory that comes with that. And second of all is he doesn't want to give up his relationship with his living girlfriend. He likes the comfort that comes with that. He likes the sex that comes with that. He likes that way of life. I think it's important to recognize that Augustine is not the full-on hedonist that, for some bizarre reason, people have made him out to be. He knows that he probably shouldn't be in this relationship with this woman. He realizes that he likes the sexual aspect of this relationship, but he's not this promiscuous, wanted, debaucherous guy running around having sex with everybody. He has this, long-term girlfriend that he's not in a marital relationship with, and it's not a healthy relationship in the end. But it's important, I think, to understand that Augustine is not the debaucherous hedonist he's sometimes portrayed as being. All right, now what Augustine articulates here is that he is afraid to give up his former way of life, to give up some of the patterns and ways of living that he's been doing. He's afraid to kind of give up his attachment to the honor and prestige of his position as a teacher of rhetoric. He's afraid of the possibility of having to give up his relationship with his girlfriend. He's afraid of moving past the way he's living now. Now, let's try to articulate this a little bit more. So I'm going to go back to the example I talked about earlier in the previous video, and that was, a pattern of on the weekends I kind of watched a lot of TV, ate Chinese food and stuff like that. Now, why would anybody be afraid? Why would I have been afraid of giving that up? Well, we mentioned part of that was I was afraid that if I gave that up, then I would have to start to face certain responsibilities and face some difficult work. I think Augustine's getting at even something deeper, though. He's getting at something deeper in that we have we become attached and to and identify with certain things that we do. So Augustine not only does he teach rhetoric, he is a teacher of rhetoric. This becomes a part and parcel of his sense of himself. He becomes he has become a teacher of rhetoric. This is who he is. This is the way he presents himself to the world. He is someone who he's in this relationship with this girl, this woman. This is again part of his identity. So it's not this that he'd be giving up a pattern or a habit or a way of life, okay, or a set of activities or a certain way of doing things. It's almost like he'd be giving up his very self. Now, this should remind you of the Gospels, where Christ talks in these very similar terms and saying, look, unless you give up your very self or deny yourself or give up your own life, you're not worthy of being my disciple or entering the kingdom of God. Now, I don't think he's meaning suicide or beating yourself up or whipping yourself or anything horrible like that. No, I think what he's getting at is you have to be willing to sacrifice these things and ways of life that you've become identified with. This sense of yourself has to be something that you're willing to move beyond in order to be his disciple. Augustine is trapped in that situation. This is the crux of what's going on with Augustine. He wants to become a disciple of Christ. He recognizes that's the right thing to do. He has seen the example of people like Ambrose or Victorinus and these other Romans who, like him, have been prominent or teachers of rhetoric and eventually have committed to and lived out a fully Christian life, a life of Christian discipleship. And he thinks, this is it, man. This is what I really want to do. But he's afraid. And there's so many times where Augustine mentions this. I just want to kind of read a couple of these because I thought it was very telling. The way, the Savior himself had become pleasing, yet I was loath to tread its narrow passes. Narrow passes, difficult, demanding, having to give up a lot, going through that narrow gate. He's like, it's so much, man. I don't really want to do it. I'm afraid I won't be able to make it. I'm afraid I'll be losing so much. I'll be giving up so much. I don't want to do it. And he is trying to find another. No, he's talking again about his friend Victorinus, who eventually becomes Christian, who goes through the same thing, though, this issue of fear. He says, afterwards, through reading and longing, he drank in the strength of Christianity. But he feared he would be denied by Christ before the angels if he now feared to confess him before men. So the same issue is he's afraid to confess before Victorinus is afraid to confess Christ before men. Why? Because he might lose his position as a teacher of rhetoric. He might lose the honorable pride position that gave him a lot of pride and gave him a strong sense of himself. He's afraid of that. And here again, this is a great quote. This is from chapter 5 of book 8. Knowledge of the truth had become certain to me, says Augustine, yet I was still bound to the earth. In other words, he's bound to his former way of life, his position of honor, his status in Roman society, his ability as a Roman citizen to do certain things. house, his comfortable way of life, his living girlfriend, all of that stuff. He's bound to the earth. And I refuse to become your soldier or your disciple. Why? This is what he says. I was afraid. I was afraid to be lightened of my heavy burden, even as I should have feared to be encumbered by it. What he's saying is that I, he's saying, look, I don't want to give all this up. I don't know what I'd be without it. This is who I am now. I've become this person. And Christ and the church are telling me I've got to jettison it and get rid of all of it. That's too demanding. That's too much. I have no idea what I would do. I mean, it's analogous to the following sort of situation. And this is, I think, why we call this a leap of faith, right? Where somebody goes to the edge of a cliff and they're told jump. And they're like, what? That's crazy. If I jump, I could die. I could lose myself. I could die. There's no support system. I don't see a bridge or a rope or a tramp or something to fall on. This looks very, very dangerous. But what this indicates to us is that a leap of faith is a jump into the unknown. It's a movement beyond what we usually understand. So what Augustine is helping us to see is that moving beyond our patterns of incontinence and the things that we have become identified with, all right, his pride and his lust, those patterns, moving beyond them is not just a loss of a pattern, it's a loss of our sense of ourself and our security in our way of life and in who we are. It's a moving beyond the safety of knowing who we are. Look, it's really easy to know who you are if you say, well, I'm in this relationship with this person. And even if it's not a great relationship and I'm kind of addicted to it and whatever, I'm still in it and that's fine. I have a sense of myself as being in this relationship. So I know who I am at least. But if I give that up, then I've given up the knowledge to face this horrible, awful fear of not knowing who I am and not knowing where I'm going to go and not having a sense of support and not knowing what's below me if I'm literally jumping off this cliff, if I'm enacting this leap of faith, what's going to happen to me? So there's a whole host of very serious and difficult questions and questions having to do with fear and anxiety and anguish that'll come upon us as we move toward this getting over the incontinence and enacting a different pattern. Now, Augustine, I think, is also pointing out the fact that our wills are very important here. And I love kind of what he's getting at. He has this discussion about how his will was never unified, and it was never complete, and it was never fully directed toward, it has not yet become fully directed toward being a disciple of Christ. In other words, he is not completely, fully, and in a heart, the deepest recesses of his heart, he is not committed to being a disciple of Christ. He has not vowed that. In other words, I think that's a helpful way of looking at it. A person who makes a marital vow, for example, vows to love and honor this person, vows to be with them in good times and bad, in sickness and health, till death do they part. So he vows, he makes the most sacred, important, and integral promise he will ever make as a human being. Augustine is saying that there's something similar that goes on with this commitment to becoming a Christian, that it's a lifelong, full promise of the full person from within the deepest part of his heart to carry out this life and live out this life as a disciple of Christ. can't, and put colloquially, you can't half-ass it. You have to have all your cards on the table. You have to be all in all of the time. So this Augustine knows to be what's at stake. And he knows that his will, though, is not fully committed to that. So what he brings up is the fact that his will is torn, and he's not, pardon the pun, but he's not willing to go the extra steps onto this journey of being a full disciple. He's not willing fully to jump in, if you will, to enter completely into the life of discipleship, being that disciple of Christ. He's holding back. And this is an issue of his will, okay? Because primarily and essentially an issue of his will. Justin makes the point that, look, he's like, I can will to lift up my left arm, boom. My right arm, boom. Put my hands together, boom. Nothing prevents that from happening. He says, but I'm trying to will myself to be a Christian, and I'm not doing that. I've made up my mind, this is what I'm going to do, and it hasn't happened. Why? Because, well, he's simultaneously willing to do that. He's also simultaneously willing not to do it. So it's sort of like a push me, pull you. It's going here, it's coming back. It's going toward, it's drawing away from. He's at war. He's torn. He's going in opposite directions in his own will. But what Augustine is getting at is that, look, his will can be unified, fully commit, then the rest of him will follow from it. So it's primarily and essentially a matter, well, of his will and his heart, I should also add, being fully committed to this. And then once he makes that full on, complete, and deeply heartfelt commitment, then the rest of him, his mind, his emotions, etc., will begin to follow along. So he's placing centrality and primacy here on his will. Now, what does it really mean, though, that you can make this willed decision and it has this sort of effect that everything follows along? What does it actually look like for our, on this deep level of our wills, to go in one direction or another direction? Okay, well, I think one of the things it looks like is the following. Sometimes when we're dreaming, we have dreams and we're asleep. We come to certain points in our dream. You can go through this door, you can continue down this path, and this is a really deep level of us, right? We're not. It's not our normal everyday looking around level. This is something very profound within us, and I would call it like this is our wills being at work in our dream state. Okay. And our wills in their dream state, without us really pausing to reflect or talk to other people about it, they go in one direction or not. And we're not really always aware of what's going on, but it's a profound kind of event in the dream state where we can say, continue down this path. And if we do, certain parts of the dream will follow along. And if we don't, that ends those certain parts of the dream. Now, I'm just going to give an example. This maybe sounds a little weird, but I think it's illuminating of what I'm trying to get at here. I remember a dream I had a number of years ago where I started to fly. And I also, though, at the same time had this kind of like primordial, very strong sense of fear. So there was this opening of my visual horizon that started to occur as I began to fly. But that opening caused a deep fear to develop in me. So I literally, I think, kind of in my dream began constructing walls, which made it such that I knew what was in my visual field, but simultaneously meant that I wasn't able to continue to fly. So it was almost like I had this moment, right? And in the moment in the dream, I could continue to fly, in which case that horizon was going to expand and expand and expand. I didn't know where I was going to go. Or I could arrest that and construct the buildings that constricted my visual field, but enabled me to know where I was going and sink me back down to earth so I felt more secure. I think that's analogous to what Augustine's talking about. Because he's like, look, if I let my will continue on this path and unify and be um, strongly and deeply and totally, completely committed to this, I don't, the normal patterns of my life are going to fall away. I'm not going to recognize where I'm going. I'm going to be led by Christ as his disciple. Holy crap, that's terrifying. So at the same time, he wants to kind of construct or put up barriers. And what are the barriers here? Well, primarily, again, his pride and his his lust, because he knows them. He's familiar with them. He knows what he's about if he's continuing to live out the life he's led. He knows what he knows who he is if he continues to be attached to his pride and his lust. And that's a strange statement. I understand that. But he's a teacher of rhetoric. He knows that. And he's this person in this relationship, and he knows that. And it's familiar. And there's a sense of the things that are familiar are we become attached to them because they give us a sense of security and a sense of safety. It's like when you go travel to a new country, easy tasks like walking to the grocery store become daunting because we don't know where we're going. We don't know how to speak the language. We don't know who the guy is selling us the food. It's all unfamiliar. It's scary. We want to fall back on the familiar because it's safe, because we know what it's about. We can understand it. We know what to expect. But what Eric Augustine is saying is that he's terrified. He's terrified of having to let himself be led beyond his normal patterns of life and embrace full discipleship of Christ. It's a terrifying prospect for him. And this is why he says kind of prefers to stay in this limbo state. He prefers to stay in this state where he's not just going back to being a Manichaean and not believing in God or anything like that, but he's not fully committing. This is analogous to what I talked about earlier of the half awake, half asleep thing. And this is, again, I'm borrowing from Augustine. You don't want to get up, but you don't want to go to sleep. So Augustine's saying, it's like, I don't want to go to sleep and pretend there's no God. I don't want to close my eyes and my mind to what I know to be true, but nor do I want to fully commit to it. I want to sort of stay in this weird limbo state, kind of lukewarm or tepid, if you will, neither for or against it. I call it, for Augustine, he prefers to defer. Prefers to defer and keep deferring and deferring and deferring his commitment, his full-on, complete commitment to Christianity. He puts it off over and over again. He's like, I'll do it tomorrow or tomorrow. It'll happen sometime. And why does he put it off? He puts it off for precisely the reason we've been talking about here. He puts it off because it means he can stay in something, a situation in life where he knows who he is, he knows what's expected, he knows kind of what's going to happen. He doesn't have to face the possibility of moving beyond his sense of security, moving beyond his sense of who he is, and embracing this new identity of being a disciple of Christ, which means giving up his self, giving up what he knows to be the case, and being led on a journey to some place he doesn't know where he's going. And let me say, just so it's clear, that can be both a physical journey, right? But more importantly, it can also be a journey of a new identity, a new sense of himself, a new sense of the world. You know, um, I remember a number of years ago when I was first in graduate school, one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced was when I got a bad grade in one of my classes. And you're like, well, why is that terrifying? What was terrifying was because I had identified myself as a philosopher and as a graduate student. That was who I was. And I get this grade and it flies in the face of that. It indicates to me that maybe I'm not a grad student. It indicates to me that maybe I'll lose my scholarship because my grade won't be very good. I have to face this radically terrifying prospect of giving up that identity. I felt like I was losing myself. I was losing this deep and essential part of myself was at risk. And I was very upset about that. And I didn't know what to do with it. I had a couple of very restless nights. And I remember just having to almost go through that death process. And that sounds weird. Well, I wasn't physically dying, right? Well, but psychologically and on a level of what I identified with, I was dying because I had to give up this image of myself. I was allowing this image to die. What happened was actually very cool because I had a certain freedom after that. And I wasn't happy with the grade or anything like that, but I wasn't terrified anymore. Now, I'm going to explain this just a little bit more because if I'm walking down the street and a Mack truck is about to hit me, I'm going to be really scared. I think my life seems to be in danger. Holy crap. Or if I find out that somebody is stalking me and they have a gun, I'm going to live in a state of constant fear because I think this person might shoot me at any time. It might shoot me when I'm going to eat dinner, when I step outside to mow the lawn, when I'm going to the bathroom. All of these ordinary things of life become laden with a lot of fear because we don't know when this stalker is going to strike and try to kill us. So something similar is happening on a psychological level, I think, that we think to ourselves, look, I'm going to have to give up who I am in order to be a disciple of Christ, in order to move beyond these patterns of life. These patterns are habitual states of incontinence. And that is terrifying. That in some respects, I think that it can be more terrifying, that psychological death can in some ways be more terrifying than actual physical death. That's a controversial statement, but I do think that can be the case. It's a really horrible prospect because we just face this abyss. We feel our very sense of ourselves kind of melting away. And as it melts away, what are you left with? You're left with nothing. It's blackness. It's utter darkness. It's like, what in the world is going on? This might be similar to what, some of the mystics describe as the dark night of the soul. So I don't want to go too far off this, but the main point here being Augustine is getting us to reflect on the fact courage is absolutely essential to this life of becoming a disciple of Christ and overcoming and moving beyond our patterns of incontinence. The courage to face the possibility of dying to our old sense of self, our old way of doing things, our old identity, if you will. the courage to face that darkness of saying, I don't know who I am, and the courage to move beyond our sense of security, our normal patterns of life that we're familiar with and that we enjoy and that give us a sense of safety and we know what to expect. Courage to move beyond that for something very noble, like that we talked earlier about how the courage is done for the sake of the noble or the kalan. Well, what's the kalan in this case? The kalan is the life of virtue, the life of discipleship with Christ. It's something beautiful, it's something noble and worth doing. But it requires us to face death, not physical death, like on the battlefield, but the psychological death, the death of dying to part of ourselves. The final thing I did want to talk about here, that as you guys are becoming priests or seminarians, so you're going to have to face the fact that people will come to you in confession, often in other situations, but often in confession, confessing the same sins over and over again. Um, they're demonstrating to you that they're suffering from incontinence. One of the main sins you're going to have to hear from people, of course, is addiction to pornography and masturbation. Um, I'd invite you to reflect on how what Augustine and Aristotle and Aquinas are getting at may be the sort of thing that could potentially be a benefit to both, of course, you in your own life, but also to you in your life as a confessor, as a minister of grace. Um, to think about, you know, how does fear come into this picture? How does laziness come into this picture? What are certain baby steps that lead to infant steps that might come into this picture? How do you avoid letting that spiral become a sinkhole? Um, you know, the widespreadness of pornography is a very serious issue, obviously, and it's again something that you guys are going to face a lot as priests. Again, I just invite you to reflect on the fact that what we're talking about here is not just an set of ideas. These are the sorts of things that are part and parcel of our lives, and they're part and parcel of your lives as priests. So, with that invitation for reflection in mind, I will close this video and see you guys next week.